June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The tropical air was heavy, thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. Two officers were hunched over a checkers board, the game halfway through, when a knock came at the screen door. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, glanced up, slightly irritated at the interruption. A tall, lean man stood there, dressed in simple civilian clothes that had clearly seen travel. His introduction came soft, calm, almost understated. Charles Lindbergh. For a moment, the name didn't register. Surely it couldn't be that Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone. But it was. Standing in the dim light of a crude recreation hut thousands of miles from home, the legend himself was asking permission to discuss P-38 combat operations. Neither man could have known that this quiet encounter would alter the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific. Over the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh would teach techniques that extended the P-38 Lightning's range by nearly 400 miles. What pilots once believed impossible would become routine. It was not just a story about fuel. It was about science defeating instinct, reason overcoming resistance, and one man's mastery of flight reshaping a war. At first, Lindbergh seemed out of place among hardened fighter pilots. He was a civilian, 42 years old, and officially barred from military service. Yet within days, he would be flying combat missions, showing aces half his age how to squeeze every last mile from their engines. His presence would force an entire air group to question everything they had been taught about engine management. His path to that screen door began 17 years earlier, over the cold expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. On May 20th, 1927, a young pilot named Charles Augustus Lindbergh climbed into a single-engine Ryan monoplane. The Spirit of St. Louis, carrying 450 gallons of fuel and no forward window. Ahead lay 3,600 miles of ocean, alone, unassisted, and without modern navigation. For 33.5 hours, he battled exhaustion, fog, and freezing rain, relying on a periscope and his instincts. When he landed in Paris with only 85 gallons of fuel remaining, he had achieved what experts said was impossible: unprecedented fuel economy from a Wright whirlwind engine. That obsessive attention to efficiency became Lindbergh's lifelong obsession. In the 1930s, as he conducted survey flights for Pan American Airways, he refined methods to stretch aircraft range far beyond what manufacturers claimed possible. He knew that every engine had a sweet spot, a balance between power, stress, and fuel burn, and that few pilots ever found it. But as his technical reputation grew, his political stance brought trouble. In the late 1930s, Lindbergh's outspoken isolationism and leadership in the America First Committee turned him from hero to pariah. President Franklin Roosevelt publicly condemned him, comparing him to a Confederate sympathizer. In April 1941, humiliated and furious, Lindbergh resigned his commission in the Army Air Corps Reserve. When the attack on Pearl Harbor pushed the United States into war, Lindbergh tried to return. Roosevelt made certain he couldn't. The same man who had inspired a generation of pilots was now forbidden to wear an American uniform. But Lindbergh's mind was too valuable to remain grounded. He reinvented himself as a civilian consultant, working with some of the nation's top aircraft manufacturers: United Aircraft, Ford, and Vought. He flew high-risk test missions, analyzing engine performance, troubleshooting production problems, and even developing new dive-bombing techniques. The pilots respected his genius, even if Washington did not. But Lindbergh wanted more than test flights. He wanted to see his theories proven in combat. That opportunity came in 1944. United Aircraft was interested in twin-engine fighters, and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning was the only American aircraft that fit the category. Lindbergh persuaded the company to send him to the Pacific as a technical representative to study combat operations. On April 3, 1944, he prepared for deployment. He bought a naval-style uniform without insignia and a small New Testament for his single book allowance. In his journal, he wrote, "Since I can only carry one book, and a very small one, that is my choice." It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn, the less competition it has. Officially, the Navy Department had authorized his trip to Marine air bases in the South Pacific. Unofficially, the White House knew nothing about it. Not even the Secretary of the Navy was aware that Lindbergh was heading into a combat zone. When he arrived, he was supposed to be an observer. But the Marines quickly realized he was more than a consultant. On May 21, 1944, he joined a Corsair squadron on a strafing mission near Rabaul. The guns were loaded. Lindbergh flew like a man born for the chaos of combat. Precise, calm, and completely unshaken. When they returned, his plane had more than enough fuel to fly another sortie, while others were nearly empty. He began teaching the Marines how to adjust their throttle and mixture to save fuel, showing them how to safely take off with bomb loads far above the aircraft's rated capacity. It worked. Accidents decreased, missions extended. The word spread quickly. Charles Lindbergh was flying combat missions as a civilian and solving problems that had baffled combat veterans. By mid-June, Lindbergh's attention turned to the P-38 Lightning, the sleek twin-boom fighter, famous for its speed and range. He knew that to truly test his theories, he had to fly with the best P-38 outfit in the Pacific, the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels. On June 15th, he hitched a flight to Finschhafen, New Guinea, and soon made contact with 5th Air Force headquarters. There, he met Colonel Marion Cooper, an old Hollywood director turned air commander, and General Ennis Whitehead, who informally approved his request to observe P-38 at operations. Paperwork was vague, but that didn't matter. In the Pacific, results mattered more than bureaucracy. On June 20th, Lindbergh trained in a P-38 for the first time, spending over an hour in the cockpit mastering its systems. 6 days later, he walked into that recreation hut at Hollandia, where MacDonald and Merrill Smith were still playing checkers. MacDonald was 29 years old, already a 10-victory ace. His group had become one of the deadliest in the Pacific. Their P-38J models had extra tanks, improved cooling systems, and powerful twin engines. But even so, long-range missions still pushed the limits of endurance. Pilots often returned with almost no fuel. Bad weather or unexpected combat could easily mean ditching in the ocean. When Lindbergh introduced himself, MacDonald listened politely, but kept his attention on the board. A civilian here, talking about combat operations? It sounded like interference. But when Lindbergh mentioned that General Hutchinson had sent him personally, the tone shifted. MacDonald invited him to fly with the group the next morning. The dawn of June 27, 1944, brought rain and heavy clouds. The airfield was a sea of mud. But by mid-morning, the skies cleared and 4 P-38s rolled down the runway. MacDonald led the formation. Beside him flew Major Thomas McGuire, one of the Pacific's top aces. Lindbergh was Blue 3, tucked neatly on McGuire's wing, his movements smooth and precise. Their target was a Japanese barge convoy at Kaibobo Bay. As the Lightnings descended, anti-aircraft fire rose in black bursts. Lindbergh weaved through the explosions, strafing the targets with deadly accuracy. All 4 aircraft returned safely. Mission accomplished. But what happened next was even more remarkable. When ground crews checked the fuel levels, They noticed Lindbergh's plane had returned with far more fuel than the others. Again and again. After a 6.5-hour mission to Gilvink Bay, he landed with 210 gallons remaining. Other pilots came back nearly dry. On another strike, when others turned for home, he pressed on, confident in his calculations. MacDonald couldn't ignore it. He gathered his pilots 2 days later in their rough recreation hall, a shack with dirt floors and a few bare light bulbs. Standing at the front, he introduced Lindbergh. "Gentlemen," he said, "this man is going to show us how to fly farther than we ever thought possible." The pilots exchanged skeptical looks. Some were curious. Others doubted that a 42-year-old civilian could teach them anything new. Major McGuire studied him closely, intrigued but cautious. No one in that room yet realized that the lessons about to be given would change everything. That one man's obsession with precision would teach them how to outfly their enemy, how to outlast the ocean, and how to turn mathematical discipline into survival. Charles Lindbergh had returned to war, not for glory, not for politics, but to prove that even in the chaos of battle, mastery of the smallest details could redefine what men believed possible. And for the 475th Fighter Group, the revolution was just beginning. Charles Lindbergh's arrival in the Pacific in 1944 marked a turning point for P-38’s lightning operations. Though officially a civilian technical advisor, his presence in the 475th Fighter Group would soon revolutionize the way American pilots flew and survived in the vast skies over the Pacific. Colonel MacDonald, the group's commander, introduced Lindbergh to his pilots with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Here was the legendary aviator, the man who had crossed the Atlantic solo, standing before combat-hardened flyers, most of whom viewed him as a relic of another era. Yet what Lindbergh was about to share would change their view of both him and their own aircraft. When MacDonald asked Lindbergh to explain how he consistently returned from long missions with far more fuel than anyone else, the pilots listened cautiously. Lindbergh described how the standard procedure for P-38’s called for cruising at 2,200 to 2,400 RPM with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. It was safe, dependable, and thoroughly wasteful. He calmly explained that the Lightning could fly farther, longer, and just as fast by reducing engine speed to 1,600 RPM, leaning out the mixture to auto-lean, and compensating with a slightly higher manifold pressure of about 30 inches of mercury. The numbers were precise: 600 RPM, 30 inches, and an indicated airspeed of 185 mph. The result, he said, was fuel consumption of just 70 gallons per hour, nearly 30% less than standard practice. Lindbergh's math was stunning. His method could extend the P-38’s combat radius by 400 miles, pushing its endurance to 9 hours. For men already enduring 7-hour missions in cramped cockpits, that idea was not encouraging. Still, the promise of extra range, the ability to strike deeper into enemy territory or stay longer over a target, was too important to ignore. The real problem wasn't endurance, though. It was fear. Every pilot in the room had been trained to avoid what Lindbergh was suggesting. Low RPM with high manifold pressure, the so-called over-square condition, was supposed to destroy engines. It was Aviation 101. Over-square meant detonation, overheating, and catastrophic failure. The manual said so. Instructors had drilled it in. Yet here was Lindbergh, a civilian, calmly insisting they had all been doing it wrong. The room fell silent. Some pilots exchanged skeptical looks. Others muttered under their breath. One even accused Lindbergh of suggesting something that could kill them. But Colonel MacDonald had seen the proof. Lindbergh's own P-38 consistently returned with remarkable fuel reserves and zero engine issues. The colonel decided to test it. Over the following week, pilots began cautiously experimenting with the technique on short, controlled flights. They expected the engines to cough, sputter, or worse, but nothing happened. The deep growl of the Allison engines changed in tone, but the temperature gauges stayed steady. Oil pressure was normal. Cylinder heads ran cooler. The pilots began to relax. Mission after mission, the new method proved its worth. Range increased dramatically. Where pilots once returned on fumes, they now landed with comfortable fuel reserves. The P-38's reach stretched from 570 miles to 700, even 750. Suddenly, airfields and targets once considered out of reach became viable objectives. The skepticism evaporated. Lindbergh's technique spread like wildfire through the group. Pilots who had once scoffed at him now copied his settings exactly. The civilian advisor was teaching combat veterans how to fly smarter, and they were listening. Lindbergh wasn't just giving orders, he was flying with them. He joined missions, led formations, and showed by example that his methods worked in the most demanding conditions imaginable. When he spoke on the radio, his call sign was simple and respectful: Mr. Lindbergh. Between flights, he patiently explained the science behind the method. Engine efficiency, he told them, wasn't about brute force. It was about balance, producing the same thrust with less fuel. High RPM wasted energy because the pistons were cycling more times than necessary. By lowering RPM and slightly increasing manifold pressure, the engine maintained output but consumed less fuel per cycle. The auto-lean setting fine-tuned this process further, giving the engine just enough fuel for complete combustion without the waste of excess cooling fuel used at auto-rich. The supposed over-square danger, he explained, only applied at extreme power levels, far above the moderate 30-inch setting he recommended. In fact, the lower RPM actually reduced mechanical stress and extended engine life. This wasn't theory. Lindbergh spoke from experience. Decades of it. His solo Atlantic flight in 1927 had been one long lesson in fuel management. His years with Pan American Airways in the 1930s had honed those instincts as he mapped transoceanic routes. And unlike single-engine fighters, the P-38 gave him a margin of safety for testing. If one engine failed, the other could bring him home. There was another factor, too: logistics. The U.S. Army Air Forces had a steady flow of replacement Allison engines and parts. The Pacific was vast, fuel was precious, and the benefits of longer missions far outweighed the small risk of engine wear. The gamble paid off. Not a single P-38 engine failed due to Lindbergh's cruise method. By late July 1944, his ideas were spreading beyond the 475th. Pilots from other squadrons came to hear him speak. Mechanics compared fuel logs. Commanders noticed that the Satan's Angels, as the 475th called themselves, were consistently flying longer missions, reaching deeper targets, and coming home with more fuel. Then came the mission that would give Lindbergh his most dramatic moment of the war. On July 28th, flying as Blue 3 with the 433rd Squadron, Lindbergh joined an escort mission over the Siram area. During the patrol, his flight spotted two Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya light bombers returning from a reconnaissance mission. They belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai, one piloted by Captain Saburo Shimada, the unit's commanding officer, and the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The Americans attacked. The Sonyas were slow and lightly armed, but Shimada was an exceptional pilot. His wingman was hit almost immediately. His aircraft burst into flames and crashed into the sea. Yet Shimada continued the fight alone against multiple P-38's. For half an hour, The Japanese captain outmaneuvered the superior American fighters. His turns were sharp and precise, his timing flawless. Each time a lightning tried to draw a bead on him, he twisted away, forcing the Americans to overshoot. Even Lindbergh found it difficult to keep him in his sights. Then Shimada did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing or evading, he turned head-on toward Lindbergh. The two aircraft closed at a combined speed of nearly 500 mph. Lindbergh had faced storms and exhaustion before, but never an enemy pilot intent on ramming him out of the sky. He aimed straight at Shimada's engine and squeezed the trigger. The nose guns roared. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon unleashed a torrent of fire. Tracers stitched across the enemy plane. The Sonya's propeller slowed visibly. Smoke poured from its nose, yet Shimada held his course. At the last instant, Lindbergh pulled up, missing the Japanese aircraft by mere feet. Below him, Shimada's Sonya rolled into a steep dive, trailing thick smoke. 2 other P-38’s fired short bursts as it fell. Seconds later, it smashed into the ocean, leaving only a brief white geyser of spray before the sea swallowed it whole. Back at base, there was quiet respect. Multiple pilots had hit the Sonya, but everyone knew whose burst had crippled it. Unofficially, the men agreed. Lindbergh had scored his first and only kill. Officially, it went unrecorded. He was still a civilian, after all, and acknowledging the kill could create political trouble. Just 3 days later, fate nearly claimed him. On August 1st, while flying a fighter sweep over the Palau Islands, Lindbergh found himself in a turning fight with a Japanese Zero. The enemy pilot got behind him, guns flashing. At the last moment, Colonel MacDonald's voice broke through the radio. "Break right! Break right!" Lindbergh rolled hard as MacDonald dove in to cover him, shooting the Zero off his tail. The close call ended Lindbergh's combat flying. Headquarters had seen enough. The civilian advisor had proven his point, and almost died doing it. But his legacy was already sealed. Within weeks, Lindbergh's techniques became standard practice across the Pacific. His cruise control philosophy reshaped long-range fighter operations and extended the reach of Allied air power. What began as a risky experiment by one controversial aviator had become a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. Lindbergh's time with the 475th proved that innovation in war often comes not from rank or regulation, but from the courage to challenge accepted limits. His quiet defiance of standard procedure didn't just save fuel. It gave the U.S. Air Forces the range to strike farther, stay longer, and win faster. In the end, the man once dismissed as a relic of the past had taught the most modern lesson of all. True mastery of flight isn't about power. It's about understanding the machine, the mission, and the margin between risk and reward. By the summer of 1944, Charles Lindbergh had completed roughly 50 combat missions across the Pacific, about half of them with the 475th Fighter Group. He had done far more than anyone expected of a civilian consultant. He had fought alongside active-duty pilots, survived close calls, and even scored an aerial victory. But by August, his presence in combat had become too great a liability. Commanders decided it was time to send him home before his luck, and their discretion ran out. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh departed Hollandia Airfield. The pilots of the 475th gathered to see him off, offering the kind of farewell usually reserved for one of their own. He had arrived as a civilian observer, a controversial figure with a complicated past. He left as a respected peer, a man who had not only transformed their operations, but had earned their trust through courage and competence. Lindbergh's influence didn't end with his departure. The techniques he had introduced, lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, leaner mixture, spread rapidly through the Pacific. By October, nearly every P-38 unit in the theater was using some version of his cruise control method. The specifics varied depending on altitude, load, and weather, but the principle was universal: fly smarter, not harder. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. Suddenly, fighters could reach targets once thought beyond their range. Bombers that had previously flown unescorted now had P-38's guarding them the entire way. Missions once cancelled due to distance became routine. In just a few months, the Lightning's effective combat radius had expanded by hundreds of miles, changing the shape of the air war in the Pacific. The operational implications were immense. Targets deep within Japanese-held territory were now vulnerable. Airfields that had been safe due to distance were suddenly within striking range. The Japanese, who had long relied on geography as a defensive shield, found themselves exposed. These new tactics directly supported General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy. Fighter range had always been one of the biggest limiting factors in his advance toward the Philippines. Now, with Lindbergh's methods, air cover could be provided for longer distances. Operations that might have taken months could be executed in weeks. More range meant more safety, too. Pilots who once landed with empty tanks now returned with precious reserves. In bad weather, they could divert safely rather than ditching at sea. Those who suffered engine damage or combat hits had a far better chance of limping home. The extended range, quite literally, saved lives. When MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte in October 1944, Lindbergh's techniques proved their worth again. P-38's flying from distant bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided escort over nearly 1,000 miles, something no one had believed possible earlier that year. The difference between arriving on fumes and arriving with an hour of fuel could mean the success or failure of the mission. Still, not everyone accepted the changes easily. Some senior officers were reluctant to embrace methods that defied established doctrine. Flight instructors and engineers had long warned against over-square engine settings, running low RPM with high manifold pressure. Even after Lindbergh's results were confirmed, a few commanders worried that the practice might shorten engine life. But the evidence was overwhelming. Units that used Lindbergh's cruise control technique saw no increase in mechanical failures. Maintenance crews reported normal wear and tear. Meanwhile, fuel logs showed dramatic efficiency gains. The U.S. Army Air Forces eventually made the new settings official, incorporating Lindbergh's findings into updated flight manuals. What had begun as one man's field experiment became standard doctrine. The revised manuals for the P-38J included detailed charts reflecting Lindbergh's recommendations for lean mixture operation. Pilot training materials were updated to teach lean of peak techniques. Once taboo, now essential. Within a few months, Lindbergh's quiet revolution in engine management had become part of official policy. But Lindbergh's story in the Pacific wasn't just about numbers and procedures. It was also about redemption. Before the war, he had been one of America's most famous and most controversial public figures. His outspoken isolationism and perceived admiration for Germany's technological achievements had made him a political pariah. His opposition to American intervention in World War II had cost him his reputation and his relationship with President Roosevelt. When the war came, Lindbergh found himself on the outside looking in, grounded, unwanted, and distrusted by his own government. The Pacific gave him a second chance. There, far from Washington and the press, his worth was measured not by politics, but by performance. The men of the 475th judged him as a pilot, not a politician, and by that standard, he was one of the best. Even America's top ace, Major Richard Bong, who earned 40 aerial victories and the Medal of Honor, publicly praised him. "Lindbergh's as hot a pilot as any of us," Bong told reporters. "He'd be out there knocking down Japs every day if General Kenny had let him." Coming from Bong, that was the highest possible compliment. After returning to the U.S. in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh resumed his technical advisory work. In October, he attended a joint Army-Navy conference at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland, where he evaluated both American and captured Japanese aircraft. His insights helped engineers understand enemy performance limits and improve U.S. fighter designs. He also continued consulting for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, analyzing engine performance data and recommending operational improvements. His influence now reached from the cockpit to the conference room, shaping design decisions and flight procedures across multiple aircraft platforms. The numbers behind his achievement speak for themselves. The P-38J Lightning carried 410 gallons of fuel internally, 2 90-gallon mains, 2 60-gallon reserves, and 2 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with the option for external drop tanks that could push total capacity past 1,000 gallons. Under standard cruise settings, 200 RPM, auto-rich mixture, fuel burn was heavy. Lindbergh's method cut consumption to roughly 70 gallons per hour, enough to extend the Lightning's combat radius from about 570 miles to 750. That's a 31% improvement. Without any mechanical modifications, with drop tanks and his cruise method combined, P-38's could now fly 9-hour missions covering over 1,000 miles, distances once reserved for bombers. It was this new endurance that enabled long-range fighter sweeps and deep penetration escort missions across the Pacific, hastening the end of the war. The strategic effect of this change rippled far beyond individual missions. Fighter range determined where the Allies could strike, which islands to invade, and which to bypass. Thanks to Lindbergh's techniques, MacArthur could choose more distant bases and skip heavily fortified ones. In a war where logistics and timing often dictated victory, that flexibility was priceless. Some have mistakenly credited Lindbergh's techniques to the famous April 1943 mission that intercepted and killed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's naval mastermind. That mission, flown by the 339th Fighter Squadron from Guadalcanal, indeed pushed the P-38's range limits, but it predated Lindbergh's Pacific service by more than a year. His contribution wasn't in achieving a single daring feat. It was in making such feats routine. Beyond the numbers and strategy, though, there was a deeply human dimension to Lindbergh's role. At 42, he was decades older than most of the pilots he flew with. They were young men in their early 20s, tough, restless, and fearless. Yet Lindbergh kept pace with them, enduring the same brutal conditions. The sweltering heat, the endless hours cramped in the cockpit, the constant danger. He never demanded special treatment. He ate the same rations, slept in the same tents, and flew the same missions. That humility, combined with his willingness to risk his life for his ideas, earned him a level of respect that no amount of fame could have guaranteed. If Lindbergh had stayed behind lecturing about fuel management, the pilots would have ignored him. But he flew, again and again, proving his theories in combat. Every safe landing, every successful mission built his credibility. By the time he left, even the most skeptical pilots admitted he had changed how they flew and how they thought. His influence went beyond the P-38. Lindbergh's success demonstrated that civilian expertise could be invaluable in wartime. In a military culture that prized hierarchy and tradition, he showed that innovation often came from outside the chain of command. His work encouraged greater cooperation between combat units and the engineers who built their aircraft. a partnership that would define post-war aviation development. The P-38 itself was the perfect laboratory for his ideas. Its twin-engine layout gave pilots a margin of safety, and the Allison V-1710 engines responded beautifully to precise mixture and power management. Lindbergh didn't just teach pilots to fly differently. He taught them to understand their machines. In the end, Lindbergh's contribution to the Pacific War wasn't measured in kills or medals, but in miles. The extra hundreds of miles that brought bombers home, extended reach across oceans, and reshaped Allied strategy. By late 1944, the P-38 Lightning had become one of the most capable and versatile fighters in the Pacific. Its intricate fuel system, with multiple tanks, transfer pumps, and redundant lines, allowed skilled pilots to balance load, conserve fuel, and extend their reach. The aircraft's twin-engine stability made it ideal for long-duration flights over vast stretches of ocean. Though newer designs like the P-51 Mustang were beginning to dominate other theaters with superior high-altitude performance and longer range, the P-38 remained indispensable in the Pacific, where safety over water and endurance mattered most. The Lightning's strengths, its twin engines, heavy armament, and agility at medium altitude perfectly suited the demands of island warfare. And when flown using Charles Lindbergh's fuel-saving methods, its range became truly extraordinary. The results spoke for themselves. The 475th Fighter Group, which flew the P-38 exclusively, achieved 551 confirmed aerial victories, making it the top-scoring Lightning group of the war. America's second-highest-scoring ace, Major Thomas Maguire, earned 38 victories with the 475th. Every success, every long-range mission completed, bore the quiet imprint of Lindbergh's influence. Over thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours, the cumulative impact of his techniques was immeasurable. Missions reached farther, fighters fought longer, and pilots came home safer. Yet behind this achievement lay an uneasy truth about how institutions handle expertise. Lindbergh's pre-war political stances had made him a pariah in Washington. His criticism of Roosevelt and his isolationist views cost him his commission and his standing. Officially, he could not serve, yet the Army Air Forces needed precisely the kind of deep technical understanding he possessed. The solution, allowing him to operate unofficially as a civilian consultant who nevertheless flew combat missions, was irregular and would never pass modern regulations. But it worked. In that compromise between bureaucracy and necessity, the military gained a unique edge. The pilots who flew with Lindbergh never forgot him. Decades later, veterans of the 475th still recalled his calm voice over the radio, his precise instructions, and his uncanny ability to squeeze miles of range from every drop of fuel. Colonel Warren Lewis of the 402nd Squadron could still quote Lindbergh's recommended settings from memory nearly 30 years later. Each pilot had adapted the techniques slightly for his own aircraft and conditions. But the underlying principle, efficient management of power and mixture, remained universal and transformative. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72, having left New York's Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center against medical advice. He returned home to Maui just a week before his passing. He was laid to rest 3 hours after death in a handmade wooden coffin built by Hawaiian ranch hands, dressed in their work clothes. His grave, marked only by a simple concrete slab, bears a quiet line from Psalm 139, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." It was a fitting epitaph for a man whose life had spanned both the solitude of transoceanic flight and the chaos of global war. Lindbergh's wartime journals, published in 1970, offered the first full account of his service in the Pacific. They revealed a man who sought not recognition, but redemption, and who found it not in headlines, but in results. His legacy was not limited to specific flight procedures. He demonstrated timeless truths. Technical mastery matters as much as courage. Civilian expertise can enhance military effectiveness. Institutions must adapt when evidence demands change, and, above all, personal example is the most persuasive form of leadership. His work in the Pacific embodied a perfect intersection of expertise, opportunity, and bravery. The theater demanded extreme range. Existing doctrine fell short. Lindbergh possessed decades of experience in fuel efficiency and engine management. He had the courage to test his theories in real combat, and the humility to work as an equal alongside men half his age. He proved that understanding, not authority, drives innovation. In this sense, Lindbergh's story parallels another wartime revelation. Just as German prisoners of war came to understand the power of American industrial capacity, Allied pilots learned the power of applied knowledge. The German captives saw material abundance as proof of democratic strength. Lindbergh's comrades saw intellectual precision as proof of human ingenuity. Both lessons spoke to the same truth: that victory often comes not merely through force, but through mastery. The P-38’s Lightning flew until the final days of World War II. Its twin-boom silhouette remained one of the most distinctive symbols of American air power. Pilots who flew it remembered its quirks: the compressibility in a dive, the tight cockpit, the heavy controls. But they also remembered its strength, its reliability, and its astonishing reach. And among those who flew it in 1944, one name was always spoken with respect: Lindbergh, the civilian who proved that the impossible was only difficult. He taught them that performance charts were starting points, not boundaries, that limits were meant to be tested. That true understanding could uncover hidden capabilities in any machine or any person. That is the legacy of Charles Lindbergh's Pacific service, not the number of enemy aircraft destroyed or the miles flown, but the transformation of knowledge into power. He came as an outsider and left as a peer. He arrived with fame and left with respect. And in 6 short weeks, he changed how fighter pilots thought about flight itself. Because of him, they flew farther, they fought longer, and they returned home safer. Lindbergh's achievement stands as one of the quiet triumphs of the Pacific War, a testament to the enduring truth that innovation, courage, and understanding can extend not only the range of an aircraft, but the reach of human possibility itself.